everyone. I'm Carl Brady with the East Alabama Works Regional Workforce Development Board, and I am the Workforce Program Manager. Welcome into the East Alabama Works video podcast series. We appreciate you joining along with us for today. Today, we're going to be talking about child labor laws in the state of Alabama, and we have our guest today, Adam Strickland, who is the Child Labor Inspector with the Alabama Department of Labor. So, Adam, welcome to the show today.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we want to really dig into some of this child labor law stuff. People talk about it all the time. We hear about it all the time. And then we come along in workforce development in the schools, and we're talking about apprenticeships and pre-apprenticeships and youth apprenticeships and work-based learning programs in our high schools. And so that always brings up a lot of questions about what young people can and cannot do, especially during the school year. What are the limitations? What can they do? We don't want to just talk about negative limitations, but what can they do? And the rules are totally different if it's a family owned business and a child working in the family and those kind of things. So just get us started with a little bit of an overview of what you do, though, and then we'll get into some of the details.
Sure. And one of the first thing you mentioned is a family owned business. That's a totally different thing, as well as things that kids do on their own. One of the first things I normally say in a presentation is that I have never shut down a lemonade stand, and no matter what horror stories people may have heard, that's just not what we do. We're not out there looking for what kids do on their own, even when they're undercutting the local landscaper and charging a little less than they do to cut the neighbor's grass. That's not what we cover. We cover when they're actually working for an employer. And sometimes if it's a prohibited occupation, it may be volunteerism, but they're generally going to be working for an employer. And
that brings to mind, you mentioned the local landscaper. Back in my day, we didn't have adults running around doing landscaping very much, but I started out 14 years old pulling a push mower behind my bicycle, going to all the yards of the neighborhood and making a little money mowing grass.
You got it. Me too. And I'm sure I was younger than 14, and then my dad would make me cut the grass of some old folks that didn't pay as good. And I didn't want to do those yards. I wanted to do the better yards. Good experience. And I still recommend that to kids whenever they call in. They're gonna make more money doing that than pulling minimum wage. But we're talking about actual employment. And in Alabama, to legally go to work for an employer, you have to be at least 14 years old, and that's federal law. So generally it's the law of the land. I bring up federal law. Generally, federal child labor law only covers businesses that do more than $500,000 a year, or they're engaged in interstate commerce. That's not $500,000 a year in profit. That's just receipts. So the U.S. Department of Labor, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, they cover businesses that meet that criteria. As far as the state, I cover everybody. So if you do business in the state of Alabama, that we have coverage as far as child labor law. And either way, the law is 14 to be employed. Now, parents who own their own business, and this is a federal statute, if parents own their own business, they're the sole owners of the business, their children of any age can work doing non-hazardous duties, provided they are purely under the supervision of the parents. And at the state level, we choose to honor that exemption that the federal government gives. So if you're a single owner business, your kids of any age can help you doing non-hazardous duties. Now, if the location or the type of job is addressed elsewhere in the law, it's still probably going to be prohibited based on that statute. But your average family that owns a restaurant or will retail restaurant or retail location, you can probably have your kids of any age doing a few things, wiping off a table or something like that. But as far as legally employing the teenagers, it's a simple process in Alabama. It's a little different than the surrounding areas. We do track where the kids work, and employers first must obtain a child labor certificate from the Department of Labor. I know that sounds horrific. Another thing you've got to go online and figure out how to do, and it's a complicated process. It takes 2 minutes maximum. You register with the state. It does cost. Everything with the government does cost, but
Right.
it's reasonable. It's $15 a year. Once you've obtained that, you are legal to employ all the kids in that age group that you would like to hire throughout the year. And we have documentation that business employs teens and all of the contact information we need if we need to follow through in that way. But the only additional thing that the business has to do is if they're under the age of 16, they're required to be in regular attendance and making satisfactory progress in school. And they have to have a statement from the school saying this kid has been in regular attendance and making satisfactory progress. But that is purely for 14, 15-year-olds. 16 and up, if you have the certificate, your business is good to hire all of the kids in that age group you want without doing anything additional. During the school year, we have some hour restrictions. 16, 17, and 18, if they're still enrolled in high school, they have to be off by 10 p.m. on the night before a school day. There's also a rule that they can't work before 5 in the morning on the school day, but that one's so rare. I rarely.
I imagine so.
Yeah.
Let's go back to the certificate for a minute.
Sure.
You said you can go as young as 14 if you have the certificate, but what's the upper side there? If you're going to employ anyone under the age of what, you have to have that certificate.
Yeah. And it's a little odd. There are some things in our law that do apply to 18-year-olds, but as far as the certificate, it's under the age of 18. So
Okay.
14, 15, 16, or 17, the business needs to have the child labor certificate. And it's not like the old work permits. It's not a certificate per kid. It's just a single certificate. The business is registered as an employer of minors, and you're good. And much easier for places like McDonald's that hire dozens of them every year. They buy their certificate, then they just employ the kids. The old work permit process had to be signed by the parents, the school, by the business. There was a whole long process, and then they had this brown form that the employer had to keep on file. The way we do it now, I like better. It's a lot simpler.
And it doesn't matter if it's full-time or part-time or anything like that. It's just if you're going to hire kids under the age of 18, you have to have this certificate.
That's correct. And they get it from our website, labor.alabama.gov. Alabama is spelled out, labor.alabama.gov. Under employers, you choose child labor, and on the child labor page, you'll see where it says apply for or renew your child labor certificate. And it really is if you type slow, it's a 5-minute process. If you type quick, it's a 2-minute process. It's really just some address information. It asks the type of business. It asks if you serve alcohol, and you pay your $15 and you print it out. You post your certificate in a conspicuous location. Most restaurants put it up with their business license or by their health department scores. Otherwise, it can be in an office or something like that. Just post it in a conspicuous location.
If you are a restaurant or some kind of small business like that likes to hire teenagers during the summer and that kind of thing, is there a limit to how many you can have on staff, or does that addressed anywhere?
Oh, absolutely not. You can completely staff your business with teenagers, and I do get a lot of complaints from parents and others of this 14 or 15 or 16, 17-year-old is closing this business by themselves. There's no supervision. There's just not a law that covers that. If you want a 14-year-old to cover your business on their own, you're welcome to do so. Might not be the best as far as a liability sense or just trusting them to take care of what they've got to take care of, but no problem with that. No problem with the number of employees. 16 and older, there's no maximum number of hours as long as they're off by 10 p.m. on the night before a school day. If that kid has school, then you're good to go. Now, the 14, 15-year-olds have a lot of hour restrictions. And with the employee shortage, the 16, 17-year-olds have been somewhat saving the day at businesses and getting jobs where adults normally work. In industrial settings, much more common to have 16, 17-year-olds, service jobs. And with that, the 14, 15-year-olds, who most people typically did not hire in the past, they have really been hiring those kids this past year for restaurant and retail, filling in the jobs that 16, 17-year-olds normally cover. The 14, 15-year-olds do have a lot of hour restrictions, though, and they are federal as well as state. 16 and up is purely state law. 14, 15-year-olds are federal as well as state. They can work 3 hours after school, not past 7 p.m. any night, even on the weekend during the school year. No more than 18 hours in a week. They're the only people in Alabama that have a break law. From 16 to 116, there is no break law in the state of Alabama. The federal government leaves that up to the states to have a requirement, and we have none other than for 14, 15-year-olds. If they work for 5 hours or more, they have to have a 30-minute documented off the clock break.
I didn't realize that. I thought that, because people are always talking about my job and they don't give us enough breaks and they're required to. So there really is no requirement for that for adults.
There's no
wild.
requirement. Federal government says that if you give somebody a break that's less than 30 minutes, you're supposed to pay them for it. That's why you stay on the clock for 15-minute breaks, but you clock out for a 30 or an hour. But that's all that they really say about it. And so everything else is left to the states. And in Alabama, for 16 and up, we just do not address that.
You mentioned 14, 15, 16-year-olds, filling a lot of jobs in the current workforce shortage that we are seeing right now. And we've had a couple of, and I know there are things you can't get into, but we've been seeing news stories lately about child labor laws being violated by some Hyundai suppliers here in the state of Alabama, or potentially being violated by some Hyundai suppliers. Again, I know you can't get into details, but how does that happen in our current society and in the modern day Alabama? What's going on in those type of situations?
Sure. At the moment, I can't comment directly on the Hyundai situation, but I can tell you somewhat how it happens. And one thing that can become really disheartening rapidly when you do this job, you come into it really assuming that everybody has the best intentions, and we're going about life, and if you have a level of success, you have a level of success because of your hard work and the things that you've done. And at times you find out that there are people that have bad intentions.
Mm-hmm.
And for the situation you're describing, we have to imagine for a moment, we'll say that a company came to Alabama from, we'll just say Germany. Well, I hate to say Germany because of Mercedes, but we'll say Germany because that's the first one that came to mind.
Mm-hmm.
And we give them tons of tax incentives and help to get set up here with hopes of good paying Alabama jobs. And that all of their suppliers move in as well. And at some point, all of these suppliers begin losing the decent paying jobs and stop using employment services that are the traditional, more popular ones that we're familiar with. And all of a sudden, they begin only using German-owned employment services. And all of those German-owned employment services only provide Swedish employees. And of those Swedish employees, the vast majority are undocumented.
Hmm.
And being that they're undocumented, they're being e-verified. In the past, I've experienced this in other places where they're just fake IDs or stolen IDs, and the stolen IDs are real information, and it will e-verify. But in this instance, you'll have places providing dozens of employees that discovered that whenever the employment service e-verifies them, it will come back saying that the information is incomplete or it's been rejected for incorrect information, and the employment services send them to the employer anyway. And they don't give them the accurate information because when you e-verify, it gives you a case number no matter what. And all they do is send them a list of employees with a case number. And what happens whenever you're choosing to save a bunch of money using these German-owned temp service or employment services from this German-owned company that's only providing, we say, Scandinavians, and all of the Scandinavians are undocumented, nobody's really paying attention that there could be some children that slip in there. And eventually there's more and more and more. And everybody turns a blind eye to it because the employment service may actually be purposely engaging in fraud. They're not concerned with it. They just want an employee in there. that's probably being paid substantially less than the original employees. And the employment service may even own their housing, and they have to pay rent. So what do you do if you owe rent to your employer if you're no longer employed by them? It becomes a debt bondage situation where it's like the old
Right.
"I owe my soul to the company store" thing. Um, anyway,
Yeah,
to
I'm thinking the
establish
same
this
thing.
precedent,
The
yeah,
story goes back hundreds of years to the old steel mills and cotton mills and mill villages and things like that, where the company owned all of the housing in the neighborhood, and that was part of you rented from the company when you worked for them.
and that's exactly what's transpiring at some Alabama businesses now. And the actual business, the only thing I can walk through a place and see children, and it must be that they just have blinders on. We don't care as
Mhm.
long as we have employees in this place and they cost half of what our other employees do, then they're good. And that's what's transpiring now. The employers believe that they're sheltered in some way because they've used this employment service, and they may be sheltered in certain areas. Now it can be, why are these German-owned businesses only employing or using German employment services when there's plenty of employment services
Right.
that already existed here? Is there some connection there? Possibly. Um, but eventually we have to say and point out that my law says that the presence of a person under the age of 18 in a prohibited environment or prohibited occupation, they call it prima facie evidence of their employment. Their presence alone means that they're your employee if it's a prohibited location or a
Mhm.
prohibited occupation. Now, if we're talking about industrial situations, 14 and 15-year-olds cannot work in a manufacturing or warehouse environment. That's a prohibited occupation.
Okay.
So their presence alone, that's a violation of our state child labor law. Now, 16, 17, they can work in a manufacturing or warehouse sort of environment, so they're okay. But as far as the question that you posed on how can that happen, that's what I'm seeing happen right now. And it's not going to just be the auto industry, but it does seem that it's mainly the auto industry, and it's mainly a specific segment of the auto industry, excluding most others. And we're pursuing it. We're getting complaints every day. We're working with other agencies. Sometimes you see news specifically, I'm not going to mention them, but specifically one other agency takes the brunt of you're not doing anything, you're not doing anything. I
Mhm.
see it. They're working very hard, and it takes a lot, I'm sure, from the head of that department to just keep saying no comment. Because when you let things out to the public, it will mess up an investigation. People start moving around, people start disappearing. And
Right.
as you can imagine, if everybody has a false ID, then it's very difficult to prove, even if you've got someone in front of you that obviously looks to be 12 years old and their ID says that they're 37, unless you can gather some accurate information about this person, or the interviewer is adept enough to get that information out of them,
Mhm.
you're at a loss. And when it comes down to it, from what I gather, no one is very concerned about the German companies only employing undocumented folks from, what did we say, Sweden?
Yeah.
They're not really concerned about that as long as there aren't kids in there.
Mhm.
And the kids part is what I'm looking at, but I'm not aware of anybody that is truly. Alabama doesn't really have authority on that. And I'm sure that we're looking criminally at trafficking and that sort of thing. But as far as just the employment of undocumented individuals being the majority placed by these employment services, I'm not aware of anything really being done towards that.
I know when I first saw those stories coming out, my first thought was, this is 2022 and it's still happening. And so you guys definitely have your work cut out for you to keep an eye on things.
Yeah. We're working on it. We're working on it a lot.
Well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about apprenticeships, youth apprenticeships, and work-based learning programs in our schools. What do our educators and our companies need to know if they're approached by a school and the work-based learning coordinator says, we've got some high school kids we'd like to put into a co-op program with your company. What are some of the things that people need to look out for in those situations, or need to know if they're participating in a work-based learning program with the school?
Sure. And we'll go back to some of this would be disconnected from the school altogether, but it all applies. I mentioned a minute ago, 14, 15-year-olds can't work in a manufacturing warehouse, workshop sort of environment. But 14, 15-year-olds can work in most restaurants, retail locations, grocery stores, that sort of thing. And I also have a good number of them that work as helpers with plumbing, electrical. There aren't restrictions on that per se, as long as they're not on roofs or are operating power-driven equipment that they shouldn't. 14, 15-year-olds can, they generally can't work in the building trades like carpenter, that sort of thing. But if mom or dad is the contractor, then they can do that at 14, 15, provided that they're doing non-hazardous duties and they're with mom or dad. So 14 and 15, it's more about where they can be. I'm sorry, yes, they can be in certain places like retail, restaurant, but but whenever they turn 16, they can be almost anywhere. At that point, it's just about the tools that they use. So 14, 15-year-olds are highly limited in where they can be. Once they hit 16, they can't work in a mine, they can't work in a sawmill, right. But otherwise they can be just about anywhere at 16 and up. A lot of people think there are restrictions against a 16-year-old working in a manufacturing environment. There's not. Federal nor state is there a restriction on them being in that sort of environment. It then becomes about the tools that they can use. And this is regardless of school status. And you're going to have things like power-driven circular saws that are off limits, any power-driven woodworking equipment, power-driven metal forming, cutting equipment with some exceptions. That they would be limited to, but they're absolutely free to be in that environment. Now, before I move to the apprenticeships, I will say I mentioned power-driven metal forming equipment. The federal government does give an exemption for machine tools. So machine tools are allowable for 16 and up, and Alabama chooses to honor that exemption as well, even though it's not addressed in our law. Things like welding at 16 and up are perfectly legal. There's nothing special you have to do to allow a kid to learn welding at 16. And then that's not in an educational environment, that's at your place of business. Now, they're still not going to be able to drive a forklift. It's a power-driven hoisting apparatus. What we come to when we move to apprenticeship is that we have the Alabama Office of Apprenticeship. I'm not sure if you've talked to Josh Laney and those folks before.
We have, absolutely.
But they will essentially do all of the legwork that the company needs to do to create a registered apprenticeship program. There are tax incentives associated with it, actually straight up tax credits associated with it. And they do the hard part of putting it together for you. That's what that office was set up for. If it's a registered apprenticeship, the kid can do anything associated with the job. A registered apprenticeship automatically allows the prohibited occupation. If it involves circular saws, they can operate circular saws. There is also another path that's referred to as student learner. That's what it says in the law. I would hope that all students are learners, but there's a student learner provision that I warn people to be very careful with. The statutes there essentially require you to set up a program that's almost identical to an apprenticeship. However, with an apprenticeship, the federal government tells you this is a registered apprenticeship, you're good, keep doing what you're doing. And with the student learner provisions, we can do almost the same thing and exempt the prohibited occupations, all of that. But the federal government never says good, you're doing great, keep doing this. They only tell you when you've messed up and they're coming to give you penalties. So I really highly encourage the apprenticeship path. The student learner thing, the only company I'm really aware of using that right now is Alstom and the shipbuilding company.
Hmm.
They're a multi-billion-dollar company. They have a team of attorneys and a big HR team to make sure that that program runs correctly. And as far as I know, they're doing it well. And just because I don't encourage that one so much doesn't mean I won't help somebody set it up. And with that being said, as far as the 16 and up being in the industrial environment, regardless of school status, one thing that I routinely do is to visit a business and look at the machines for you and advise you as to whether they're allowed or restricted under state law. And I'll put that in writing for you and tell you that these machines are okay. I'll also do my best to communicate with the U.S. Department of Labor. U.S. Department of Labor, they do trainings and they'll communicate with you in a general sense, but that the only way they're going to send an inspector to your business is if it's a law enforcement role. That's if you've had a complaint or whatever. They're coming to inspect you. They're not going to send somebody to check out your machine. I will come and check out your machines. And I also will communicate with the U.S. Department of Labor and get some advice on them. If there's any question as to whether it's covered or not, they won't always give me an absolute answer, but generally we can come pretty close. And if there's any gray area, then they normally side on the be careful. I don't play in the gray area. If it may be restricted by the federal government, even if I say it's okay, I'm not going to set somebody else up to have problems. But generally, it's going to have to be something that cuts, lifts, or molds materials by power. And even in those situations, if that machine that cuts, lifts, or molds by power is enclosed appropriately, if you're loading it in a certain way, if you're controlling it via an iPad, or then that's most likely our statutes aren't going to catch it. There are a lot of things that 16 and up can do in the manufacturing environment, in a workshop, warehouse, mechanic shop, anything like that, within the law, without involving career tech in any way. Now, in an educational environment, they're free to do all of those things anyway. But once it moves to the actual workplace, there can be job shadowing roles and other programs that associated with the schools that allow them to come in temporarily and learn a few things. Once the student is doing work that's providing a profit for the business, or could be considered that they're doing a job that somebody else would be doing for pay, at that point they become an employee. Whether there's pay involved or not. But otherwise, they can be in that environment. They can do virtually any job that doesn't involve something that cuts, lifts, or molds with powered equipment. And if it's a registered apprenticeship, they can do all of that no matter what. There is a statute that says that if the employment is procured through the Department of Education and approved through the Department of Labor, that we can exempt certain prohibited occupations. However, I'm never going to do that and get somebody in trouble with the federal government because
right.
That doesn't necessarily, just because we have a law, it doesn't necessarily negate what the bigger law is.
Or somebody gets hurt, something like that. How much do insurance companies help you out with your job? Because we hear a lot from companies that we'd love to participate in that program, but my insurance company won't let me let anybody under 18 through the doors.
Yeah. And a lot of times they're telling a little story there. Or actually,
I realize that. Yeah.
Their insurance agent has heard this myth throughout the years, and we all do it. I'd say the first couple of years that I was child labor inspector, I was quoting laws that didn't exist because that's what my boss taught me and what her boss had taught her. And sometimes things just spread by word of mouth over the years. But the truth is that workers' comp insurance, that's the one that's most commonly brought up. Workers' comp is, and I'm not an expert on insurance, but I know this from our workers' comp division, It is not set based on the age of the individual. Workers' compensation insurance is set based purely on the job itself. Age never comes into consideration on that.
Okay.
So that's the most common one. Our workers' comp is going to be too expensive if we have teenagers. That's just not true. However, if you carry liability insurance, depending on your carrier, as with any, just like when you have a teenager that turns 16 and starts driving, the liability insurance on your car insurance will go up. You can have an increase in your liability insurance cost if you're employing younger people, but workers' comp purely based on the job itself. And that's the one I most commonly hear the complaint concerning.
Right, right. Well, Adam, we're up against the clock. Is there anything that we haven't mentioned that you feel is important enough to bring up this morning?
Well, we hit the ugly stuff. We hit the easy stuff. I let it be known that I'm available. If you call me with questions, you're never going to be a target. I am glad to come and visit your business and tour the facility and try to tell you what the teenagers can and can't do. My cell phone is readily available. It's on the website on the child labor page, labor.alabama.gov, under employers, child labor. You can find me right there. We're not out to get anybody. In fact, I don't want to do all that paperwork from getting somebody. I want to do things right to start with. And I'm glad to help, and I'm here anytime somebody needs me.
That's awesome. Well, Adam, thank you very much. We'll have your contact information in the details portion of the video as well for folks who would like to contact you. But again, you can just go to labor.alabama.gov and to get all the information you need and contact that information, as you said, for you there as well. Well, sir, thank you very much for joining us and providing this information for us today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And folks, we thank you for watching the East Alabama Works video podcast series. I'm Carl Brady with East Alabama Works, and we'll see you next time.